Democrats would need to flip at least 24 seats in order to win back the House in 2018, and a new Supreme Court case could help them get there. That's because it is being asked to uphold a lower court's ruling that redistricting in Wisconsin gave an unconstitutional advantage to Republicans. Wendy Weiser is director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, and she joins me now. So, Wendy, gerrymandering is at the center of this court case. Let's start with a definition. What is gerrymandering exactly?
So gerrymandering is when politicians manipulate voting maps when they draw district lines to lock in an unfair advantage for one political party. This is something that has been around in some form since the founding of our nation, but nothing as extreme or like what we are seeing today.
So have we seen it in both the Republican and Democratic parties?
You know, over time, both Republicans and Democrats have engaged in gerrymandering. But again, the gerrymanders of the past are not nearly as extreme and sophisticated as the kind of gerrymandering that is plaguing the country today.
So the Supreme Court has weighed in on cases of gerrymandering before. How is this case different?
Well, in the past, the Supreme Court actually 3 decades ago found that partisan gerrymandering is inconsistent with the values of our Constitution. But then for years, it was unable to settle on a standard for when maps go too far. More frequently, the court has weighed in on redistricting disputes involving claims of racial gerrymandering, where there are claims that politicians, for example, just this year, in 2 cases, the court found that North Carolina had unconstitutionally packed African-American voters into fewer districts so as to reduce their voting strength. And so racial gerrymandering has been a very common thing at the court, but partisan gerrymandering, really, we have an opportunity now for the first time in decades to address that problem in the Supreme Court.
And how much of an issue has gerrymandering been in Wisconsin?
Well, in Wisconsin, the lower court found, again, for the first time in 3 decades, that there was an unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. And in that case, the Republicans had, in 2010, had won for the first time in 40 years both legislative houses and the governorship, and took that opportunity to lock in a majority that would last a whole decade. And so in the next election, even though they actually won only 48% of the vote, they took in more than 60% of the state legislative seats. And the court found that was unfair, it was extreme, and it lasted a long time. No matter how many times the voting patterns would change, the Republicans maintained this very significant majority in the legislature.
So if the Supreme Court did take on this case, could other states' maps be affected by its ruling in the short term?
In the short term, there are a few states' maps that might very well be affected. The next in line is North Carolina. North Carolina, as I just mentioned, has several of its legislative maps that are being sent back as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. Well, what the legislature did after its congressional maps were thrown out as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders is sent it back and said, well, okay, let's ignore race. We're going to draw district lines to give Republicans a 10-3 advantage in the congressional maps, even though in a state where it goes 50-50 Republicans and Democrat. And so that is a state, so now that same claim and those same maps are up before the Supreme Court again, this time as illegal partisan gerrymanders.
And how have technological advances affected gerrymandering?
Well, the gerrymanders of today are much more effective, in part because of 2 developments in the digital age. First, we have a lot better and more sophisticated and complete data about voters, so we can predict better their voting behavior. We also have much more sophisticated mapping technology. And taken together, map drawers can use this to be much more precise in drawing maps that will actually lock in an advantage and be effective over a decade. And we're seeing that this year, all the partisan gerrymanders we're 7 years into the decade, and they're still sticking. No matter how voters are changing their minds, those partisan advantages are sticking.
Fascinating. Wendy Weiser from the Brennan Center. Wendy, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks for having me.